Hey, I'm going to kick this off. I'm sure more people will be coming in, but I want to start introducing the workshop and everyone very briefly. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, from wherever you are joining us today. Welcome and thank you for joining this workshop of the Society for Conservation Biology's Marine Program on deep sea mining policy. Um, My name is David Costalago. I'm the policy officer of the SCB Marine Board, as well as a senior marine scientist with Oceana, and I will be facilitating this workshop today. And before we begin, just wanted to make a quick note on the logistics. First, I want to inform everyone that this meeting is being recorded. Please keep your microphones muted unless you are invited to speak. And feel free to use the chat during the session to put your questions for the speakers. And then my colleague Katie will keep an eye on the chat, and then we will have a Q&A session after the panel. The goal of the workshop today is not to resolve the deep sea mining debate, but to build a shared understanding of the scientific, legal, socioeconomic, and also importantly, ethical landscape around this topic. We will try to identify policy levers, thanks to our experts, policy levers that actually might have traction. And then we will also explore what the SCB marine community could realistically do in the next 1 or 2 years. And the structure of the workshop is very straightforward. So we'll have short expert talks of 20 minutes each, and then a moderated panel discussion followed by the Q&A session. And after that, we'll take a break before going into interactive group work, where we will discuss some policy options that I will explain later. So we are very fortunate to have this amazing lineup of speakers today. I will introduce each of them in more detail just before they speak, but just wanted to mention who they are. We have Dr. Andrew Thaler, Dr. Diva Amon, and Angelo Villagomez, and also as a moderator, we are lucky to have Nicole Sanesco. So let's go on with the talks. Our first speaker is Dr. Andrew Thaler. Andrew is the CEO of Blackbeard Biologic, and he works as a science and environmental advisor there. And he's also adjunct faculty at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. And his work sits at the intersection of deep sea ecology, emerging technologies, and science communication. So Andrew will set the stage by talking about what we currently know about deep sea ecosystems and biodiversity, and the state of the art in deep sea mining technologies. So Andrew, over to you.
All right, all of that in 12 minutes. Let me do a quick, is that screen share working for everyone? Good. Okay, I'm not gonna do full screen because it does weird things when I do that, but it's kind of a big topic. Hopefully I can condense as much as I can down into 12 minutes, but we'll have a lot of time for discussion afterwards. The first thing I want to highlight, and that I always like to highlight, is that we talk about deep sea mining as one cohesive industry, but in actuality, it's three very distinct industries with very different technologies and very different environmental impacts that are impacting different ecosystems in the ocean. So the most dramatic and the one that I think gets the most people's hackles raised is seafloor massive sulfides. If you're a mining company, you call them seafloor massive sulfides. If you're an environmentalist or an ecologist, you call them deep sea hydrothermal vents. So this is direct mining of hydrothermal vents. The other two mining prospects are cobalt-rich crusts. We would call these seamounts. So these are areas of exceptional biodiversity on the deep sea floor where you have interactions with commercially important fish species, and you also have accumulation of things like coral mounds and all these other wonderful things that grow directly on the ore deposit. So with both seafloor massive sulfides and cobalt-rich crusts, you're directly and catastrophically removing the substrate of the ecosystem in order to mine it. That is also true for polymetallic nodules, but on a slightly different scale. And that is largely because polymetallic nodules are these small cobblestone-sized rocks scattered across vast areas of the ocean seafloor. And so they cover a much larger proportion of the seafloor than something like a hydrothermal vent, which, the total surface area of all known hydrothermal vents in the world is smaller than the island of Manhattan. Seamounts are, of course, also small, discrete ecosystems. Abyssal plains, where you find polymetallic nodules, are enormous ecosystems that could cover up to 50% of the surface of the planet. So very, very different scales when we're talking about these. Because the vast majority of work on developing deep sea mining right now is focused on polymetallic nodules, I'm going to talk mostly about what's going on with polymetallic nodule mining. And if we want to get into cobalt-rich crust mining, which is not happening a lot right now, but there's some proposals out there, or hydrothermal vent mining, which is surprisingly moving forward in several areas. We can get into that during the discussion. But polymetallic nodules, as I said, they're these cobblestones that form on the deep abyssal plain in specific areas of the ocean. Uh, Generally speaking, they cover these vast areas. And what's interesting about them from a mining perspective is that they're rich in cobalt, they're rich in nickel, they're slightly enriched in copper. They're not particularly exciting when it comes to copper, and they're very rich in manganese, which is why they used to be called manganese nodules. Now, mining companies will say, "Oh, this is a huge area of the seafloor. There's not a lot of biomass down there. The deep sea is I've heard mining company CEOs in congressional hearings say the deep sea is more akin to a desert than a rainforest. You just don't see animals down there, and they'll share pictures of the seafloor like this, where if you're not a trained ecologist, this looks like a fairly depauperate ecosystem. Although I'm sure Diva, who's seen this picture before and can probably pick out, the dozens of sponges and corals and other little things hiding in all these nooks and crannies. Um, but the reality of the deep abyssal plain is that there is this trend towards very low biomass. So it's true that there's not a ton of individual organisms compared to some ecosystems, but exceptionally high biodiversity. So what you get is you get a lot of novelty and a lot of biodiversity, but very few representative individuals of any one of those species or any one of those families. And that actually makes them very vulnerable to extinction and very vulnerable to disturbance. When you have these kinds of high biodiversity but very low biomass, you are exceptionally fragile. And there are just even among the macrofauna, there are a tremendous amount of species that we find on the deep abyssal plain, and especially in nodule fields. Nodule fields can be 2 to 3 times more biodiverse than the surrounding deep abyssal plain. And you'll find corals that grow on top of the nodules, sponges, crinoids. Um, a lot of mobile fauna that you may not often sample when you're driving around with an RV, because RVs are noisy and loud and shine bright lights everywhere. And so large mobile fauna tends to be able to get away. And that doesn't even account for the microbial diversity within the sediment of the nodule fields. So these are tremendously biodiverse regions that can be pretty significantly impacted by deep sea mining. Just a couple kind of highlight species, because I like to talk about the cool ones that we've seen recently. So this guy on the bottom here, this is a whiplash squid that was recently discovered in a polymetallic nodule field in the CCZ, and it sort of hides within the nodules with two of its tentacles out, and is an ambush predator, so it captures whatever happens to be swimming by. That new species of squid that was discovered, I think, just last year. This guy over here, this is a xenophyophore. It's the largest single-celled organism in the world. It's a multinucleated single-celled organism. So lots of nuclei, but just one cell. And they can grow up to the size of a football. And we find them in polymetallic nodule fields as well as on seamounts. Um, Taxonomically, it changes about once every 10 years. I think throughout my career, they've revised the placement of xenophyophores about 6 or 7 times. So they're a very basal life form. They're currently aligned with forams at the moment, but that'll probably change 2 or 3 more times in the next 2 decades. Is an American football, or the football in Europe? American footballs. We use American standard units in my office because we like to do nonsense. Uh, so you do get a lot of diversity of life down there, a lot of unexpected diversity. this impression that the vast abyssal plains are largely depauperate is kind of a myth that is being promoted by mining companies because it's to their advantage not to. Although I will point out that uh, nobody argues that the rainforests are tremendously biodiverse, and that sure hasn't seemed to protect the rainforests from exploitation either. So what are we actually doing? And I say we, certainly not me, but we as a society, what are we talking about doing? What we're talking about doing is collecting these nodules that sit on the seafloor using a series of fairly sophisticated marine robotic systems. The most common systems use these tracked crawlers. So imagine your standard Caterpillar bulldozer with big, heavy tracks that settles down onto the seafloor. It has a vacuum pump system that sucks the nodules up as it plows across the seafloor. It obviously, of course, sucks up sediment and any animals that are sitting on those nodules as well. It pumps them up to a production support vessel on the surface through something called a riser and lift system. And one of the main concerns with the riser and lift system is that it's an incredibly noisy system. The nodules are processed on a production support vessel, a ship at the surface. They are dewatered, so they're washed, and all the wash water and wastewater is taken off the nodules because you don't want to ship seawater around the world. And that water is then pumped back down into the ocean through a secondary pipe system and released either in the midwater or the deep water, or even some proposals have put that release at the surface, depending on who you're talking to. The vast majority of companies are talking about a midwater release, so they're pumping the water back down to 1,000 meters, 2,000 meters, and releasing it into the water. There are a couple of other weirdos in the deep sea mining space that have proposed other sorts of technologies. There's one company, Impossible Metals, that is proposing these kinds of autonomous, neutrally buoyant AUVs that have a series of collector arms underneath that are selectively plucking nodules from the seafloor. And they claim that there's a much lower environmental impact using this system because the robot itself is not coming in direct contact with the seafloor, and they can be more selective about the nodules that they're picking. It's an incredibly experimental system. They only have one prototype. It's never been tested at depth. So one of those things that it might be promising, it might be a total disaster. It still remains to be seen. But there are other technologies on the horizon that different companies are developing to kind of get around the impacts of these large tracked crawler systems. And the tracked crawler systems do have pretty significant impacts. One of the major impacts of concern is the benthic plume. So as this crawler travels across the seafloor, it's obviously disturbing sediment. It's producing this plume at the seafloor that spreads and persists beyond the crawler vehicle. A lot of recent studies have shown that the actual benthic plume doesn't spread particularly far compared to how some original models were predicting. It tends to be much more constrained to the direct mining area. But even then, if you're running a tracked crawler back and forth across the seabed, that direct mining area becomes hundreds of thousands of acres that are being plowed. So the impacts there are fairly significant, as well as the impact of compressing the sediment beneath the crawler tracks to begin with. And those plumes can be pretty dramatic when they're kicked up. Um, they can bury organisms in the surrounding sediment. They can certainly disturb any suspension or filter feeders. They can create chemical signals that can distract anyone who's navigating using the chemistry of the deep sea floor, because of course this is an incredibly stable, homogeneous environment. So these kinds of disturbances have pretty profound impacts that spread beyond where we can imagine. There's only been a very few long-term impact studies that have been done on deep sea mining, and that's predominantly because it's a relatively small industry, and it had a lot of support in the 70s and 80s that kind of flared out in the 90s because the finances were never actually there, and it's only recently rearing its head back up. So there's the Discal site, which is in the Peru Basin, in the Pacific Ocean, and then there's a test site on the Blake Plateau, which is off the coast of the U.S. East Coast. So at the Discal site, they did a disturbance experiment about almost 30 years ago, 35 years ago now, I think, where they simulated the impacts of a deep sea mining tract. Obviously, they're using a different kind of technology. They're basically using a beam trawl, a heavily modified beam trawl, but a beam trawl to simulate those impacts. And what they found going back 26 years later is that largely the seabed had not recovered. You see some microbial communities returning. You see some large mobile scavengers returning. But the composition of the community after mining was completely different than before mining, and the abundance was also much lower than before mining. On the Blake Plateau, we have another interesting story, a different story. So the Blake Plateau um, was the site of a equipment test rather than an experimental test mine. So they dragged several tracks across the Plateau to do a collector test. And you can see this is a current picture of the Blake Plateau. It's from 2025, 2024. And you can see the tracks from the crawler are still very much there. Recovery, again, they didn't have great recovery surveys from before the test mining, but when you compare the sites away from the Blake Plateau mining sites to the sites where the tracks actually were, much, much lower biodiversity, much, much lower abundance. And importantly, on the Blake Plateau, as has been recently discovered, it's also the site of the world's largest deep sea coral reef. So there is a coral reef that is larger than the state of Vermont that sits atop the Blake Plateau where they did this experimental test mine. We did not know that this coral reef was there or as extensive as it was until also 2024, 2025. So almost 50 years after an experimental deep sea mining test passed almost right over it, we discovered this entirely unique and novel ecosystem. And I think this really highlights kind of the real risk and the real challenge when we're talking about doing environmental impact assessments in the deep sea, understanding what the impacts of deep sea mining is going to be in the deep sea, is that we really are just at the beginning of understanding uh, life in the deep ocean. There are ecosystems as big as Vermont that we, despite the Blake Plateau being studied for 50 years, we didn't know about until very recently. That was within 2 kilometers of a mining site. So I actually mapped out where that first test mine was, that Deep Sea Ventures test site, right in the middle of this is kind of the distribution of coral mounds on the Blake Plateau, right in the middle of that distribution, and within 2 kilometers of pretty significant coral heads that we didn't know about until 50 years after the tests had been completed. So, one of the real risks is that for polymetallic nodule mining in particular, 2 to 3 years, within 2 to 3 years of a polymetallic nodule mining operation, we'll almost double the number of observations made on the deep sea floor if the mining companies are honest about using ROVs to monitor the entire system and being transparent about providing access to the ROV feeds. What that tells me is that over those 2 years, and certainly over the lifetime of a deep sea mining operation, they are going to find things that are new and novel, and not just like a new species of amphipod or a new kind of nematode, but entirely new ecosystems that we currently lack the biological framework to even predict. And because of that, we need to be very, very cautious about how we advance with deep sea mining and about how much uh, information needs to go into every single deep sea mining site before any mining is allowed to commence because every mining site is going to be different and every mining site is going to have unique and novel communities that are found nowhere else in the world. I'm pretty sure that's at my 12 minutes, so I am going to pass it over and not take up too much more time and figure out how to turn off screen share. Sorry. There we go.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew, for this helpful overview on the biological complexity and the technology that some companies are developing, as well as the impacts of this activity of the on the seabed. So our next speaker is Dr. Diva Amon. She's a marine scientist at the Benioff Ocean Science Lab at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and she's been deeply engaged in the International Seabed Authority process. So her talk will walk us through where things currently stand at the ISA, at the International Seabed Authority. So Diva, thank you for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, David, and good morning, everybody. I'm just going to arrange. Oh, can you give me screen share?
Yeah, Diva's not a co-host.
Yeah,
Can you make her a co-host real quick?
thank you.
Yeah, working on it. Sorry, Diva.
That's okay. So as David said, I'm based at the Benioff Ocean Science Lab at the University of California, Santa Barbara, but I'm actually not based there. I'm based in Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, where I also co-founded and co-direct a small NGO there called Species. Okay, great. Thank you, Katie. Okay, can you see my screen? Perfect. So Today, as David said, I'm a deep sea biologist. I've worked in a lot of the places that Andrew has spoken about. But today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about the policy landscape, particularly around the International Seabed Authority. So what we're going to cover today is what is the ISA? What has the ISA done so far? What is the ISA doing now or next? Why is all of this very challenging from a policy perspective? Some new challenges that are emerging, the threat of unilateral mining, and then what are potential steps that the global community is taking. So for many of you, it may be the first time you're hearing about the International Seabed Authority, and it's essentially a UN-affiliated organization. It does not sit within the United Nations, but is alongside it. And so it's a treaty-mandated body. By treaty, I mean the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is what brought this institution into reality. And it's mandated to regulate mineral resources in the deep sea, and particularly, or only, I should say, in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So that means beyond the 200 nautical miles extending from coastal states. And I'll show you a map shortly. What is unique about the minerals that are found, that you just heard about from Andrew, that are found in this part of the ocean, areas beyond national jurisdiction, is that they're the common, what is referred to as the common heritage. So essentially, it is that these mineral resources, but legally belong to all of humankind, not to individual states, not to companies. And the International Seabed Authority, their regulation is meant to exist it's a regime of equity, essentially, is what it's supposed to be. It is not supposed to be on a first come, first served basis. This is meant to serve the interests, again, of all of humankind. The ISA is also mandated, interestingly. So yes, it's mandated to regulate mineral resources and develop those mineral resources, but it's also mandated to protect the environment. So a bit of like a, catch-22 there. It's also mandated to ensure participation and also to make sure that any of the benefits that come from mining these resources, that they are shared equitably. The benefits are shared. And that's not just the monetary benefits, but there's lots of non-monetary benefits like capacity building and technology transfer, for instance. And at the International Seabed Authority, it is composed of at least 5 different sorts of bodies that you can see in this diagram here. The Council is comprised of 36 states. That is the decision-making part of the ISA, and they meet twice a year in Kingston, Jamaica. There is the Assembly, which is every UNCLOS signatory country, so 167 states plus the EU. They are members of the ISA and they have a right to vote and a right to participate and benefit from any of the activities that the ISA is regulating. There's also the Secretariat. That's essentially like who runs all of this, and again, as I said, is based in Kingston, Jamaica. And then there's also a finance committee as well as a legal and technical commission. The legal and technical commission has been expanded to 41 experts, and they are the ones who really go through the technical matters. So what Andrew was talking about, a lot of that science and essentially looking into how well regulated this industry will be from an environmental perspective, they are meant to do that. They also do things like ensure companies are sticking to the contracts that they have signed and what they have agreed to do. Those types of very technical matters. So, as I mentioned, the International Seabed Authority is responsible for governing mineral resources in areas beyond national jurisdiction. In case you don't know, the ocean is divided into 2 main forms of governance within national jurisdictions or exclusive economic zones. That's the black areas that you can see on this map. And then there's also the blue areas, which is that is international waters. And so on this map, they may look small, but you can actually see where are some of the main areas that the International Seabed Authority has granted licenses. And so far, they have granted actually 31 licenses in international waters. The majority of those, as you heard from Andrew, are here. If you can see my cursor moving on the left of the US, that is the Clarion-Clipperton zone, where there have been 16 or 17 contracts that have been granted for polymetallic nodules. Then in the mid-Atlantic, you can see these green blocks here. That is where there are further, I think around 4 to 5 contracts that have been granted for polymetallic sulfides or seafloor massive sulfides, as you heard from Andrew. There are also contracts granted on the Indian Ocean ridges, central and southwest here. Those are for polymetallic sulfides or hydrothermal vents also. And then over here in the off of Asia, on the right of Asia, we have an area that's been granted for cobalt-rich crusts or ferromanganese crusts, as well as there's 1 or 2 nodule claims there as well. So in total, there are already at least over 1 million square kilometers that have been granted for exploration as a precursor to exploitation. To be clear, there is no mining yet happening in international waters. However, there have been exploration contracts that have been granted. But when we look at, the International Seabed Authority, one of the reasons that it was brought into play is that the potential mineral resources on the seafloor are great, which is what you can see here in this second version of the map. Each of these red or green blotches or dots are where there are resources. So you can see that there's the potential, there are mineral resources spread across the ocean, and there's the potential that if mining moves forward, that this could be an industry that absolutely changes the face of the planet and definitely needs to be regulated. So what has the ISA done so far? Well, so far, as you heard, it's already granted these licenses for exploration, and linked to those, it means it's adopted 3 sets of exploration regulations, 1 for nodules, 1 for sulfides, and 1 for crusts, the 3 different resources that Andrew spoke about. They have also done several things like come up with recommendations for guiding contractors who these licenses have been contracted to. They have also come up with a regional environmental management plan for the Clarion-Clipperton zone, that area where there's the most interest. But what is important to know about all of this is that it is a very light touch regime. Essentially, it requires contractors to self-report, which we all know hasn't necessarily worked well in the past. So it relies on self-regulation. There's been all environmental data that contractors are mandated to collect have not necessarily been made publicly available, or at least publicly available in a way that is useful to anyone, follows fair data principles, et cetera, et cetera. The EIA process, many have argued, has been flawed for testing, et cetera, et cetera. So while there has been progress made, there's also a long way to go with regarding what has been done already. So then what is the ISA working on now? Well, the next step is really the exploitation regulations, and they have been working on that as Nicole and Andrew, others who have been in the rooms, these negotiating halls in Jamaica, they can tell you this is something that's been going on since 2014, well over a decade, has been spent negotiating these regulations. Currently, what is happening is there are draft regulations, and there are essentially working groups working through different aspects of those regulations. And of course, this is a slow-moving process, right? You're trying to get all of the countries who have signed on to UNCLOS in the world, 167 countries plus the EU, to come to a consensus on these regulations. That is how these regulations are going to be adopted, by consensus. So that is, of course, again, a very challenging thing. And states now are really refusing. There is pressure, as Andrew has said. Some states would really like to move forward quickly, whereas others are refusing to be rushed because there are so many outstanding issues. And also, not just outstanding issues, but there have been many challenges around the procedures being done, being used to develop these regulations. Many are arguing they are not fair, et cetera, et cetera. So just to give you a little bit of a taste of the outstanding parts of this mining code and the ISA regime is, for instance, the EIA procedures under exploration need further resolution. Where a lot of the details of these regulations are going to be is in accessory documents to the regulations. So things called standards and guidelines, essentially. And none of those have been fleshed out yet. There are no regional environmental management plans for all of the areas where the ISA has granted contracts except the CCZ. So many of those need to be put into place. Fundamentally, there is no equitable benefit sharing regime. So what is meant to underpin the entirety of the ISA's operations, that sharing of benefits equitably, that does not exist. And of course, as you can imagine, it's a really complex thing to navigate. Countries that have minerals on land need special privileged coastal states, landlocked states. There's a lot to consider. How do you share these things in these benefits in an equitable way? And there's a lot around data management. Stakeholder engagement is something that the ISA has, many would say, has been very poor on. And there's a lot more to be done around training, technology, transfer, capacity sharing, etc., marine scientific research, and so on. There is a lot more to do, including some of the cornerstones of this regime. And I should also say, if you want to read more about that, there's a brilliant paper that came out 2 years ago, or the year before last, by Chris Pickens and others, which really outlines what are those outstanding issues and why each of them is so critical. So why is this challenging? I've already hinted to some of that, right? But it's essentially trying to get consensus amongst so many different states with so many different interests in the world. On top of that, you've got the fact that there are contradictory mandates that have been established by UNCLOS to protect the environment while also developing the mineral resources, right? Contradiction 101. Deep sea mining, as you heard from Andrew, really technically difficult thing to achieve. It's high tech, it's lengthy, it's remote. How do you regulate an industry like that? A really fundamental aspect, as again you heard from Andrew, is that we're really lacking the scientific underpinning to inform all of these regulations, to essentially ensure that this industry can be regulated in a way that allows the protection of the marine environment. That science does not exist. And of course, again, we're in a really fraught geopolitical context. There's a bunch of other challenges there for you. And I'm happy to share these slides also after for consideration. But this is a slow-moving, complex beast. And it, I think, has been until fairly recently, it has been happily slow-moving. However, of course, there is another challenge, which is this wonderful man. In that last year, we saw when he came into power in April, I think it was, he put forward an executive order called Unleashing America's Offshore Critical Minerals and Resources. And I'm sure Andrew and Angelo and Nicole and I will talk a bit more about this in the question and answer. So I'm not really going to go into the details, but essentially that executive order has really paved the way, along with a bunch of regulatory decisions that have been made by NOAA and BOEM and others, for the US to not only think about developing mineral resources within the US's EEZ, but also in international waters. And so this is really unprecedented. This is the first time that a state which is not a signatory to UNCLOS, the US has not signed on to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is the first time a state is circumnavigating that and essentially saying it doesn't matter about the 167 plus states, it doesn't matter about any of the regulatory precedent that has been set. We don't care, we're moving forward to mine these minerals. And that, of course, not only is it really a challenge to multilateralism, of course, but it's also really puts into jeopardy the idea around UNCLOS and the ISA that it should be underpinned by equity. It really doesn't help to resolve or solve any of the issues around how these benefits could be shared. In fact, it does the opposite, where the US would essentially keep a lot of this for themselves. But despite this challenge that has come about in the last sort of year in a way that hasn't been seen before, That doesn't mean that the rest of the world or a lot of the rest of the world isn't still moving on a trajectory towards a moratorium. What is wonderful is this industry hasn't started yet, and many different groups of stakeholders realize that this is not necessarily to start deep sea mining on the scale and using the methods that are currently being positioned is not at all in line with the sustainable use of resources. So what that means is that so far, just in the last 3 years, we have seen more than 40 countries stand up, sorry, 4 years, countries come forward and say they are not supporting deep sea mining moving forward right now. They are calling for either a moratorium or a pause until enough scientific knowledge and all of the associated institutional mechanisms are in place to ensure that deep sea mining can move forward in a way that doesn't cause harm to the marine environment. I think that we can surely have a discussion around whether that's even possible, but that is what all of these countries are saying. In addition to that, it's not just countries, but we've also at the bottom, you can see there are a number of financial institutions that have committed to not funding deep sea mining activities or activities related to deep sea mining. There are a number of companies, enormous companies, that have said they will not source minerals that come from the deep, use minerals sourced from the deep sea. And in addition to that, there are a number of key individuals like David Attenborough, the UN Commission on Human Rights, Aquaman, Jason Momoa. Many of them have come out against deep sea mining. So there certainly is a growing and very loud global opposition to this industry. So to wrap up, what can you do? Well, there is the ocean. If you haven't signed it yet, there is an ocean expert statement here. And actually, with 970 ocean experts have signed on. So if all of you were to sign on today, that would push us over the 1,000-person mark, which would be a pretty big milestone for that statement. If you have any sway with companies, seafood organizations, etc., there are other statements that they can sign on to and show commitment within. And I think it's really important. A lot of deep sea mining companies that stand to benefit from this are saying that a moratorium is inconsistent with international law. However, there have been numerous studies that have come out that say that it is not only consistent with international law, it's required by it. And many are arguing that it is pro-science, it is pro-governance, it is pro-equity, and it is pro-stability, taking that precaution to make sure that this is something that we do want to or not want to move forward with in the future. There's also, as I mentioned, the ISA is based in Jamaica, Kingston, Jamaica. They meet twice a year, annual sessions in March and July. And the International Seabed Authority is meant to reflect all of humankind. So there is the potential for, if this is something that interests you or is related to your work, that people can attend. For instance, there are delegations such as the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, where they do take scientists and policy experts. You can apply to join their delegation, and there is support as well as others. And I guess I just again want to underscore and leave you with the fact that yes, this may seem like a remote industry. It may seem like something that is is far away from us and doesn't necessarily impact us. But as you heard from Andrew, it absolutely has the potential to have enormous ramifications. But we all have an opportunity to make a difference and show leadership and really help to push towards responsible global stewardship and collective working towards a common good. So happy to be with you again and looking forward to your questions later on. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Steva. That was a very clear presentation about the ISA structure, roles, processes, but also the current policy as in. I think that's going to be very helpful. Our third speaker is Angelo Villagomez. Angelo is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he focuses on ocean policy, equity, and governance. And he will bring in the ethical dimensions of deep sea mining, including indigenous rights, benefit sharing, global equity, etc. Angelo, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. I didn't prepare any slides today, but if I had, they would have been pictures of underwater rocks and beaches and smiling indigenous peoples. So if you get bored, just kind of imagine that in your head. And those are the sorts of images that I'm trying to bring today. So good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you today. First of all, I just want to thank SCB and especially David for organizing today's workshop on deep sea mining. I want to thank everybody on the East Coast of the United States for waking up early and joining us. My name is Angelo, and I work for an organization in Washington, D.C. called the Center for American Progress. I'm going to start my talk today by saying something you don't often hear at the start of a conference panel. I wish I didn't need to be here today. I wish I didn't have to think about deep sea mining. 2 years ago, I was working closely with the American government, imagining what was possible in ocean conservation. I served on the Federal Advisory Board, making recommendations on area-based management to the government, and was on a National Academy of Sciences panel studying how to make ocean science more equitable. The Biden administration was advancing a number of new national marine sanctuaries across the country and existing protected areas that I had helped designate during my career that had languished as designated and unimplemented were transitioning into active management. And then as Diva pointed out, the American people elected Donald Trump to a second term. The advisory boards on which I served were dissolved on day one, and then through a series of executive orders, the Trump administration began accelerating the sale of public natural resources to private corporations. All of our marine monuments, accounting for 26% of all U.S. waters, have been opened or in various stages to be opened to industrial fishing. All oil and gas development in the Gulf of Mexico has been exempted from Endangered Species Act restrictions, and waters off California, Texas, and Florida are being leased to oil companies. In 2 years, the United States has gone from imagining what is possible to questioning, how the hell is any of this even possible? A year ago, there were 0 proposals for deep sea mining from the United States. But today, the Trump administration is undermining the International Seabed Authority and considering issuing mining permits on the high seas, violating the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples by leasing the seabed around indigenous communities in the U.S. Pacific territories, and helping American companies gain access to the seabed in various small island developing states in the Pacific, like the Cook Islands and Tonga. So I'm on this panel out of necessity, not choice. 12 months ago, I wouldn't have even said that I worked on deep sea mining. But when the Trump administration started exploring the potential for deep sea mining around American Samoa, I got involved through 2 coalitions, Right to Democracy and America the Beautiful for All. Both coalitions have worked on the importance of uplifting the concerns of the U.S. territories, so we organized an online petition that was just for citizens from the territories to sign. Our hope was that we'd create a way for the voices of the territories, who are majority Brown, Black, and Indigenous peoples, to be heard. With that first effort, we collected over 2,000 online signatures. A few months later, the process repeated itself for the waters of my home islands near the Mariana Trench. Our second petition collected over 5,000 signatures. We used the emails we collected to update our supporters in the territories and around the country. And if you want to join our email list, you can sign our petition and check the box that says you want updates. I'll drop that in the chat after I'm done talking. But before I really begin, I want to flag something that may be useful context for this conversation. Today, I published a column on deep sea mining efforts in Alaska in the U.S. Pacific territories. If you want a deeper dive into the economic, equity, and governance issues I'll touch on today, I encourage you to visit our website at americanprogress.org and give it a read and share. It lays out in much more detail why many indigenous leaders have described the current push for deep sea mining as resource colonialism, and why the communities closest to these projects are likely to receive damage, but not dollars. I was invited to speak today and asked to cover 4 topics in 12 minutes, and I think I've already burned through 4. First, Indigenous rights. Second, equity and power. 3, global South perspectives. And then 4, benefit sharing in the global commons. So when we talk about these 4 topics lumped together, we're really talking about governance. Not in the abstract institutional sense, but in the most basic human sense of who has voice, who has veto, who lives with the consequences of decisions made far away, and how all of this is allowed to take place. I'll begin with Indigenous rights, because this is where the ethical stakes are clearest. For many indigenous communities, especially in island and coastal communities, the ocean is not a commodity. It is a relative, a teacher. It is a sustainer of culture, language, and identity. That relationship does not end at the shoreline or at the edge of the continental shelf. It does not vanish as depth increases. Yet modern ocean governance often treats the deep sea as if it exists outside of human relationships altogether. Just as an example, a few years ago, I found myself trying to explain to an environmental reporter why finding pollution in the Mariana Trench was scary for the people living next door in the Mariana Islands. And I struggled to articulate my thoughts because it was so obvious to me why this was a problem. The framing of the deep sea void of people makes it easier to dismiss indigenous consent as optional or symbolic or irrelevant. But free, prior, and informed consent cannot be just a procedural inconvenience. It is a recognition that indigenous peoples are political actors with the right to say no. When deep sea mining advances without that consent, particularly in U.S. territories and other colonized places, it reinforces a long-standing pattern. Indigenous communities are expected to absorb risk for projects they did not design, do not control, and will not meaningfully benefit from. Which brings me to equity and power. At a recent congressional oversight hearing in the United States, deep sea mining was presented as low risk and environmentally neutral technology that would use AI to avoid ocean life and only pluck the right nodules off the seafloor. The mining executive argued his proposals were governed by objective science and rational economics. But risk is never neutral. Power determines whose risk is acceptable and whose is invisible. Territories like the Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, and American Samoa do not have equal standing in U.S. political systems. They cannot vote for the president, their representation in Congress is limited, and yet they are being positioned as sacrifice zones for activities that primarily benefit corporations and distant decision makers. This is not a failure of science. It is a failure of democracy. Equity demands more than impact mitigation after decisions are made. It requires shared authority at the moment decisions are formed. Without that, the language of national interest or energy security becomes a justification for concentrating power and wealth upwards and exporting harm outwards. The same dynamics play out at the global scale. Many countries in the global south are being told that deep sea mining represents opportunity, that it is a way to participate in the blue economy, the green energy transition, to generate revenue, to compete in a resource-hungry global economy. But we need to ask, opportunity on whose terms? When nations facing climate vulnerability, debt pressure, and limited development pathways are encouraged to gamble on irreversible environmental damage, that is not a fair choice among equals. It is a narrow corridor shaped by inequality. This is why so many global South leaders and civil society groups are calling not for marginal reforms, but for caution, pause, and in many cases, moratoria. In the Micronesia region, where I'm from, Palau, Marshall Islands, and Micronesia called for a global moratorium on deep sea mining in international waters, and they've each taken domestic action as well. And Diva just spoke of the 40 countries calling for this global moratorium. The leaders of these nations all know the lessons from the 20th century phosphate mining in nearby Nauru. Extractive booms rarely deliver lasting prosperity to those closest to the mine. They deliver volatility, dependency, and ecosystem destruction that cannot recover on political timelines. And finally, David asked me to talk about benefit sharing in the global commons, but honestly, this is not my strong point, and I hope that some members of the audience have a stronger grasp of these issues and bring that knowledge to the breakout groups. But the idea that deep seabed mining, the idea that the deep seabed is the common heritage of humankind is a powerful one. But in practice, access to the deep sea is determined by capital, technology, and geopolitical influence. My understanding is that benefit sharing arrangements remain largely hypothetical. Meanwhile, the environmental costs of mining, the sediment plumes, the biodiversity lost, the disruption of carbon cycles, everything that Andrew talked about, will be immediate and likely permanent. True benefit sharing would require clear guarantees, not just redistribution of revenue, but protection of livelihoods, long-term monitoring funded in perpetuity, meaningful decision-making power for affected communities and a recognition that some places may simply be too important culturally and ecologically to industrialize at all. We don't have so much a scientific problem with deep sea mining as we do a political one. If governments consistently listen to scientists, many of us probably wouldn't have jobs. We need to understand that political problems need political solutions. Science won't save us from Donald Trump. And I want to end where I began. I said at the start that I wish I didn't have to be here today, and I don't completely mean that, but I kind of do. I don't want to be in meetings about how to govern deep sea mining my people don't want, any more than future generations should have to sit in meetings about how to repair ecosystems we knowingly destroyed. The fact that we are here debating how to make extraction more equitable, how to manage harm more fairly, is itself evidence of political failure, not progress. If Indigenous consent were respected, if science were allowed to guide policy, if democracy extended fully to territories in the global commons, this conversation would be unnecessary. We would be investing our intellectual energy in protection, not mitigation. So the question is not just how to govern deep sea mining responsibly. The harder question is whether we are willing to draw a line, to accept when we are told no, to say that some places are not bargaining chips, that some risks are not acceptable, and some futures are worth defending even when powerful interests disagree. Deep sea mining forces us to confront a simple truth. Commercial resource extraction combined with political inequality produces predictable outcomes every single time. And unless we change who has power, who has voice, who gets to say no, we will keep reproducing the same hierarchies, just at greater depth. The deep ocean is not empty, and deep sea mining is not inevitable, unless, of course, we allow it to be. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thanks so much, Angelo, for such a wonderful and inspiring talk about the ethical and justice aspects of deep sea mining. And thanks again to all three speakers for setting such a strong foundation for what comes next, and also for your efforts to synthesize all that information in just a few minutes. Moving on with the panel, I'm now very pleased to hand things over to our moderator, Nicole Senesco. Nicole is the International Policy Advisor for Oceans North, where she works on deep sea mining, the BBNJ Treaty, and governance measures for the Central Arctic Ocean. She is also the North America coordinator for the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, and she spends probably too long at International Seabed Authority meetings. Nicole, thanks for moderating, and now over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and to the panelists, thanks so much for great presentations. That was wonderful. Just before I start with some of our pre-planned questions that I have written out, I just wanted to remind all the participants, if you have questions, if you want more information on anything, even more information from me or from any of our panelists, please write it in the chat, and I will be following the chat, and I'll read them out and make sure that your questions get answered. So thank you. So to start, I have a question for Diva and Andrew, but again, Angelo, if you want to jump in to any of these questions, or if someone that I don't tap wants to jump in, please answer them and we can have this be more of a fluid discussion. But our first question is, a common point of discussion regarding the commencement of deep sea mining is how much scientific knowledge is sufficient. So could you speak to the state of knowledge of deep sea ecosystems, what it would take to increase our knowledge to a point where we could make more informed and rigorous decisions, and how policy can support and reflect this need? And feel free to talk about the ISA or about national jurisdictions as well, whatever you prefer to talk about. You know, Diva or Andrew, which one of you wants to go first? You can draw straws.
Andrew's already unmuted, so.
Oh no. You know, I think a really critical thing here, and I know everyone gets frustrated when scientists say we just don't have enough data, we just don't have enough information. And I actually push back about that in the deep sea context, because I think we do have enough information to know that in general, the impacts from deep sea mining are permanent. and the loss of biodiversity will be permanent. The risk of extinction is extremely high, and the trends of discovery in the deep sea suggest that we will lose incredibly novel ecologic processes and incredibly novel ecosystems, likely before we even have a chance to quantify them. So, at some level, I think we have enough information to know that the harm is unacceptable, I think, to the vast majority of the scientific community. And it really now becomes contingent upon the mining contractors themselves to demonstrate that within their specific lease blocks, within the specific unique regions that they want to mine, that they have a comprehensive enough understanding of those particular regions that they can build a proper environmental management regime. And I don't think we've seen anything coming close to what a proper environmental management regime would look like yet.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Andrew. I think it's really hard to say what is enough information. But I think there are some really good examples that show that yes, we have enough information in the context that Andrew has said. We can say that extinctions are likely, harm is irreversible, etc. However, if we're thinking about management, there are a lot of examples that really make the case that we do not have even close to the level of information that is needed for management if this industry were to move forward. So just to give you an example, there was a paper that came out maybe 2 years ago by Muriel Rabone and others. And what that paper found was in the area where there's the most mining interest in international waters, the Clarion-Clipperton zone, in that area, there were more than 5,000 species recorded, and about 90% of those had not yet been described so therefore were new to science. Okay. So if you struggle to even say what species live in a place and you don't know anything about them, then how are you going to be able, if you don't understand their ecology and what's there, to be able to say how they're going to be impacted and then to mitigate those impacts? And so 90% were new to science. And then a further, I think it was around, I don't want to say the wrong percentage, but around 50% were also yet to even be discovered, as in they hadn't even ever been recorded. Okay. And this is thousands of species we are talking about living in this part of the deep sea. And so that's just one example. I think another great one, which Andrew can probably expand on, is like the maps. Many of these places that are potentially that have been licensed don't even have maps of what the seafloor looks like. They have not been mapped. The maps are generated from satellites. So I think there is sufficient information, and then there's like the most basic level of information. And we don't even have that, much less sufficient.
Yeah, so it's kind of a very very specific example, and this is, I ran these numbers about 3 years ago, so I'm sure they've changed by now. But there is a hydrothermal vent field on the Indian Ocean Triple Junction, the Lonki vent field. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. That is one of the ISA mining exploration leases. And I pulled the actual amount of bottom time that was spent with ROVs studying this vent field, and it was about 175 hours. So functionally, what we're talking about is, this area was equivalent to, not as big as something like Yellowstone, but it was pretty close. I can't remember which national park I compared it to, but it'd be functionally equivalent to discussing strip mining Half Dome after spending a long weekend hiking in Yellowstone. So we really are just at the very, very beginning of discovery. We've seen less than 1/100% of the deep sea floor, and we really are we are exactly where we were 200 years ago in terms of deep sea exploration. We are just getting started.
Thank you so much, both. Those were great answers. I had sort of a follow-up question, and I think, Andrew, you touched on this a little bit, just with the responsibility and sort of the connection between science and deep sea companies. So I wanted to ask if you could both talk about the challenges of lots of deep sea research opportunities being provided by and funded by deep sea mining companies. Of course, it's hard to get out to a lot of these areas in the deep sea. And we've seen the companies be the, major providers, right, and opportunities where a lot of our kind of flagship papers are getting published out of. And the International Seabed Authority is struggling with this idea of marine scientific research versus exploration and contractor pressure. So I just would really love to hear you both reflect on that and speak a bit about that to this group.
Should I go first?
I think it's your turn.
Okay. I mean, I think so. We have some work underway now that is showing that there is a fundamental legal and potentially, in some cases, practical difference between what the ISA calls exploration and marine scientific research. I think in the deep sea world, we throw around exploration a lot, like often we're going to somewhere for the first time, we're exploring it. But actually, in ISA terms, exploration has a very specific legal meaning. And then it does also in a practical sense often. So I think just some, in 2013, I worked for the university, 2013 to 2016, I worked for the University of Hawaii. And at that time, the project that I was working on, we were actually contracted by a deep sea mining company to do their baseline surveys in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, in the most eastern contract area of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. So essentially, we were taking money from a deep sea mining company to do their science for them. And I can tell you, even if you approach these things with the best intentions, there is still a lot of flaw in that relationship. And I think that comes down to really like the motivation of why this is being done. At the end of the day, these companies are there to make money and will try to cut corners in every single way that they can, and essentially will not go above and beyond. They will tick the boxes they need to get that contract. And we all know that science, when done in a fundamental science for science sake, fundamental science, that is not done that way, right? And there are many differences in a practical term as to when you are able to ask your own scientific questions and do your own science in the way you want to, versus when you're being mandated to answer certain questions and are being provided with certain tools. And that's another thing. It's the mechanisms by which the science is being done. So often, what would happen again, this is just my personal experience, but what would happen is we would request a certain piece of equipment to use, for instance, to do the surveys, because we know that's what the tool that we need to do the best possible survey. And then we would be provided with something that was substandard. And so then we would end up with substandard results and have to analyze those. So I think there are lots of sort of nuances as to this. It is tricky, right? Like the deep sea working there is incredibly expensive. It requires incredibly, a lot of technology. And there are very few resources to go around for the planet's scientists. And so you can see why having investment from a corporate entity would be useful. However, ultimately, what underpins that relationship is that company is there to make money. And that means that there are lots of things that do and don't happen. And before I hand over to Andrew, I also so I had mentioned during my talk that any company or country that has a contract with the International Seabed Authority is again required to make all of their environmental data available, publicly available. The ISA has just not done a very good job of that. They have a database called Deep Data that they've created, and it has a long way to go. A few years ago, as part of various assessments, various scientists tried to access that data, see if they could get anything usable out of it, and there was very little. It doesn't have the quality assessment and control that is required of a database of that standing. So I think, there are actors in the deep sea mining world existing that do a better job than others and are publishing their science in peer-reviewed papers, et cetera, There are others who just aren't, and all they do is put it into the International Seabed Authority database. There are others who do even less. They don't even put it into the International Seabed Authority. And I think what underpins all of this is that the International Seabed Authority, as a regulator, is not doing a good job of holding its contractors to account. So if you can't even hold your contractors to account to put their data into a functioning database for the environment, then how are you going to regulate them when they actually do something that isn't great, right? That is terrible for the environment or terrible for people or whatever it is. So there's a long way to go. And I think what we do need to see, even though it's challenging, is more independent research. And that means totally decoupled from mining interests is mine. Yeah. Andrew, sorry.
Thanks, Diva. That was great.
Yeah. So I would add I also did a report for an NGO assessing the quality of the deep data portal from the ISA. And they also take that data and dump it into other major international databases. And one of our conclusions from that was that the data quality was so bad that we should consider data pollution as another source of impacts from deep so
That is hilarious.
So full disclosure, my PhD was funded by a deep sea mining company called Nautilus Minerals. They were working out in Papua New Guinea, and I actually just recently published an op-ed at Manga Bay talking about the experience of being at sea with a mining company and how that shaped how you look at the industry and how that shaped my overall impression of the industry. As Diva said, the quality just wasn't there. They cut corners where corners didn't need to be cut. We had more downtime on that cruise than any other cruise because equipment broke frequently. Instead of bringing in a research ROV, they brought in a trenching ROV that you'd use to lay subsea cables. And so we were driving a 6-ton trenching ROV rather than a little guy like Jason or any of the good proper deep sea ROVs. So it does impact how data is collected, and input in is input out. The data in is data out. The lower the quality of the data you can get, the lower the quality of the results you can conclude. And I think, there's a real problem we have right now where funding for science across the board is at an all-time low, especially under this administration, but not unique to this administration. It's been in decline for quite a long time. The U.S. research fleet is about half what it was at the end of the 1980s. We are falling significantly behind in our deep sea research capacity as a nation. And I think when we reach a point where the only people who can actually field these kinds of capital class equipment, who can only field the kinds of tools that can do a proper exploration of the high seas are major commercial interests, we really lose a lot of the potential independence that you would gain from having a national research fleet that's supported by academia, that's supported by, as unbiased as government funding can be. Like certainly we're not in a position where we can pretend that academic funding or federal funding is not biased either. But having long-term investments in research capacity is really what we need, and we don't have that right now. We are still losing ships and we are still losing vessels. We've retired, I think, half a dozen deep submergence vehicles since I started working in deep sea ecology. So we are now at like half the number of available submersibles, half the number of available ROV assets that we used to have. And so the mining companies are going to sweep in and they're going to be like, well, we have the resources to do this. We can do it. Leave the exploration and discovery to us. And so now we are become dependent on the deep sea mining companies to be funding fundamental research that should not be funded by commercial interests. The point of fundamental research is that it's done ahead of commercial interests. And so I think we need to get back to a model where we have national funding for research capacity. I don't think there's a solution to that we're going to solve in this workshop, but good God, we need it.
Thank you so much, both. Those were fantastic answers, and really great personal anecdotes as well. Thank you. I think that was a really great sort of back and forth on what we need in the science and what we need in funding and some of the tensions and nuances. And so I wanted to pivot a bit and ask Diva and Angelo about governance safeguards and governance issues. So what governance safeguards must be in place before any commercial mining applications could be adequately reviewed? And so I'm hoping we go a bit beyond just, the scientific analysis, thresholds, things like that we've talked about a bit, and consider consultation, social license, loss to fisheries. So, what kind of governance mechanism, safeguards, um, pieces of regulations do you think need to be implemented? And this could be at the International Seabed Authority, or Angela, if you wanted to talk about the US situation a bit, that's also totally fine. We can get into some of the RFI issues if you want.
I was just gonna suggest that Diva tackle international and I do domestic.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Angela, you should go first because I've been talking a lot.
Sure. I mean, so domestically, countries can do kind of whatever the hell they want in their own exclusive economic zones, and countries have been talking about mining their own EEZ for like a long time. When the Cook Islands was designating their big marine protected area 15 years ago, they very clearly exempted deep sea mining, and that they were only going to address some of the tuna fishing. And so that means that, like, at a domestic level, you actually have to have experts from those countries who understand how they work. And you're going to have to take one at a retail level. There's going to be no global answer for each of these individual countries. In the United States, the United States tends to push its pollution, and there's a trigger warning. The United States tends to push its pollution onto Black communities, and it tends to push its natural resource extraction onto indigenous communities. It's been going on for 200 years. It's not a new thing. This is not the first rodeo with this sort of issue. But the Trump administration is pushing for deep sea mining in the U.S. Pacific territories and Alaska. And it's really close to shore. When we were talking about the high seas mining, the Clarion Clipperton is 1,000 miles from Hawaii. The area under discussion is 50 miles from Guam. And this is an island that gets almost all of its money from Japanese and Korean tourists coming to sit on the beach and drink a Mai Tai. What will be the effects of, literally, if you stand on the mountain, you'll be able to see some of the vessels out there that are ripping up the seafloor. And if you've paid any attention to some of the news in that region, they were just hit by a Category 5 typhoon, and the island is absolutely devastated. And they had about 72 hours to kind of prepare for that. These are a lot of human dimensions to consider before you allow activities such as this to take place. And with a lot of this resource extraction, Alaska is kind of unique in the United States in that they've created some ways for local communities to benefit from oil drilling. If you live in Alaska, you get a check every year just for living in Alaska, and it's from a lot of those royalties. But on Saipan, we have these things called preposition ships, and they're military ships that just kind of sit offshore. And the people who work on them are highly trained engineers who know how these giant ships work. And like our people just don't have that. We're farmers and fishermen and teachers and accountants and hotel workers. And, we at the moment, we're not trained on how to mine the deep sea and to work these vessels and to be engineers. So it's very likely that the economic benefits will flow to the people of these communities who are living, within miles or kilometers if you're in the U.S. From where it's taking place. So, at a minimum, one would assume that the governments, the duly elected people of these communities, whether it's Alaska or the territories, would be involved in allowing any of these activities to move forward. And there's, when it comes to fisheries, there's a little bit more of this. Like there's a fisheries council, they have advisory councils for fisheries, and community members are able to participate. There's decades worth of experience there, and I have lots of criticisms of the fishery. So I don't want you to think that I'm saying nice things about the way that the whole America manages its fisheries. But like there's universal opposition for this and Guam and American Samoa and the Northern Mariana Islands. So it's just repeating the same things that have happened in the United States for, literally decades and centuries of indigenous peoples being steamrolled as their natural resources are taken away from underneath them. So, the governance thing that we need to do is, sadly, in the United States, this is coming from one half of our political party, it's a political problem. It has a political solution. And we need to change political parties. That's kind of like the only real recourse that we have. And sadly, we can't vote for president because we live in the territories.
Thanks, Angelo. And if I could add, just for folks who might not be following some of the US domestic situations with deep sea mining, the requests for information and public comment periods have transpired for the national areas that they're considering opening for leasing. The American Samoa comment period saw 80,000 comments. Almost all of them were in opposition, and the Alaska comment period saw 90,000. Again, almost all of them were in opposition to deep sea mining. And recent news has come out that BOEM is considering opening up the lease sales first and then doing consultation after with local and indigenous communications. So when we're talking about governance mechanisms like consultation, actually reading and bringing on the comment period feedback, all of those things are critical components and they're not happening. So even though there is local fight, and they're gearing up for even bigger local fights, like if the government isn't even following their own regulations and their own rules, it becomes extremely difficult. So it is very basic governance things here that we're seeing being degraded, right, in the US. So that's just some added information. And then Diva, yeah, let's go to
And
the
I was
entry
actually going to
report.
ask, thank you for adding that, Nicole. And I was going to say that you are far more in the know than I am on ISA governance. So please feel free to jump in as well. But I'll just share a few reflections first. I think there is the ISA, if it were a puzzle, it's like maybe 3 or 4. If it's a 500-piece puzzle, maybe 4 or 5 puzzle pieces exist and the rest just is still in the box, right? There is a lot of work that needs to be done from a governance perspective. And so I'll start with the environmental stuff. There are key missing components, baseline data, so that there is something to weigh change against, for instance, is a massive one. Indicators and thresholds of change, those have not yet been decided on. Like, what are the parameters that are going to be used to indicate change? What are the benchmarks which mining companies should not be able to cross, right? Or that will, if they do cross, will then bear penalization, etc. That just doesn't exist. How do you manage an industry without both of those things? You don't. Area-based management tools, mechanisms by which to ensure that parts of the seafloor remain as close to pristine as possible. And then I think there's the issue around inspection, compliance, and enforcement. This is an industry, as Angelo said, for the international waters that's going to be taking place hundreds to thousands of miles away from countries. How do you ensure that companies, mining entities are doing what they said they're going to do when you are that far from shore? And there have been all of these ideas that are being thrown out of the ISA, like, oh yes, we'll create a digital twin that can get us real-time data from, thousands of feet below the ocean so that we can have this real-time monitoring. It's like, guys, you guys can't even create a database for your environmental data, and you think you're going to be able to monitor and manage an industry in real time that's happening thousands of feet below, thousands of feet out to sea, thousands of meters, kilometers out to sea, and thousands of feet in the ocean. Come on, let's try again, right? Let's be honest about where there are deficiencies. And that's just from an environmental perspective. I think the ISA itself as an institution it's had funding constraints, right? Its funding, the ISA's operational funding, is also linked to the success of this industry, which again, talk about a conflict, right? And so because this industry hasn't yet begun, they have been cash limited or resource limited. And that means that they just haven't been able to put many of the things in place that they need to be an efficient regulator. So I think they need to increase their regulatory capabilities. But I think I want to go back to what Angelo has discussed from a domestic perspective, which is the human dimension of all of this. The mineral resources in areas beyond national jurisdiction are the common heritage of humankind. They belong to all of us on this call. They belong to every person on the planet. They belong to every generation yet to come. And that means that all of those people need to benefit from these resources if they're being exploited. That is not an easy thing to do. So the fact that there is no equitable benefit sharing mechanism that has been developed, that makes sense, right? It's hard. But that is what underpins this entire entity. It should not exist if it cannot equitably share these benefits. And there are many studies coming out that are actually showing that the benefit, the monetary benefits at least, are going to be incredibly limited. Why are we moving forward with this industry if there isn't going to be benefit to countries and people around the world? Questions. I think also related to this equity aspect is stakeholder engagement. I mean, it's not quite as bad as what's happening in the US, but it's definitely pretty bad. So since the ISA has been in existence, what has been happening there is that the countries who tend to attend the International Seabed Authority negotiations and be vocal are those that have stakes. So either they have mining contracts or they have sometimes terrestrial interests, etc. It's those who have more of a stake than others. Everybody has a stake. Every country has a stake. But these are those that have interests, right? Financial interests. And so because of that, you're getting a very biased set of voices in the room who are pushing these negotiations forward in a certain way. And that's just one sort of countries are just one stakeholder base, right? Like until recently, there's been next to no Indigenous participation. There has been very little participation from developing, less economically developed countries around the world. There has been very little participation from countries that have terrestrial mining interests. There are a lot of stakeholder groups that are almost entirely missing from this conversation. If you talk to many people around the world, they'll be like, what is deep sea mining? I don't even know. And yet we all have a stake and we all have a say. And then the final thing I was going to say around, I can't remember now. It's fine. Nicole, do you have anything to add? It'll come back to you.
Yeah, I was going to add maybe two things. As Diva said, we both go to the ISA a lot, so we spend way too long there. One thing, just jumping off Diva's point, is it's a bit of an anecdote story, but I think it's representative of a greater issue around equity at the ISA. A few years ago, we were having 3 meetings a year. And Diva, you might even remember when this debate took place. I think it was during the July assembly meeting or council. And the ISA was discussing, member states were discussing if they would be able to host a third meeting again, or if they would have to move down to 2 meetings a year. And we had multiple countries, and specifically a Pacific Island country, say we actually cannot afford 3 meetings a year. Like if you think about how much it takes to send delegations of people all the way to Jamaica, multiple flights, some of them are crossing oceans, like to get from Australia to Jamaica is tens of thousands of dollars. Even for like the Canadian delegation, a trip to like an ISA trip can be $30,000. That's from like Ottawa to Kingston. That is
And
one of the shortest.
and the negotiations are a week to 2 weeks to 3 weeks at a time.
Yeah.
Right.
So like for the Canadians, like that's the Canadian government and they're having a hard time, 30,000. So imagine that, exponentially greater for the trip and for different countries. And when this country said, we can't afford it. It's too much, but we have a stake here. We want to participate. They were even running one of the negotiating groups. Like they were a crucial member in the ISA and a crucial part of the negotiations. And multiple countries, the UK and Norway and others were kind of like, I'm paraphrasing, but we're like, we're sorry that you can't afford it, but we still want our third meeting. The UK, and so you can I don't have to explain the irony in that one. So that's like representative, I think, of like major deep-rooted equity issues at the ISA, where they say that it's benefiting all countries. They say that developing countries have equal or more power, but at the end of the day, like who is running the agenda, who is pushing the speed of negotiations? It's the countries that show up, who can afford to have 9 or 10 experts on their delegation, who can afford to lead the working groups, who can afford 3+ meetings a year. So it's not equitable, right? Just at its very foundation. Another thing on the monitoring, if you're looking at at the cost of monitoring equipment, like of the ROVs, of what this like landscape of like expert Star Trekky monitoring things would be. It could be millions of dollars. And it's like, who's going to pay that? Does that come out of the ISA cost? Does it come out of what could be benefit sharing? Who pays that? Do the companies pay that? And then then the industry isn't even financially viable anyway. So there are so many questions there. And I think the ISA is in a bit of a midlife crisis or crisis of identity right now where it doesn't know what it is if it isn't this, but it's not good at being this. And so we're trying to push them towards like an evolution or a reimagining of what the common heritage is, what this like governance structure could be, because it is in crisis and the countries are in crisis, and Trump and unilateral mining has only exacerbated that. So it's like, what is the alternative? Which is quite exciting. And also a bit scary, I think, for a lot of the delegates.
Can I add the other thing that I remembered?
Yes,
Nicole,
please.
totally agree. The other thing that I wanted to flag is that again, a critical part of what all of the companies or countries that have been given licenses are meant to do, as well as the ISA Secretariat itself, is enable capacity building and technology transfer. There are issues around the term capacity building, but we're just going to go with it for now. We're just going to acknowledge that and go with it for now. That is something that all of these entities are meant to do. And yet, I mean, the same similar is happening within the BBNJ negotiations. Everyone is concentrating on the area-based management tools and MG marine genetic resources, and capacity building and technology transfer is largely being left to the side. And again, this is about equity. And so if we want all nations to be able to have to be able to participate fully in these types of negotiations, there has to be strengthening of capacity and the transfer of technology. And that is just not happening. So far, what exists at the ISA is like a workshop here or there that people get invited to, or a cruise here or there that people get invited to. And there's no measurement as to whether that capacity building is effective or not. And it's very much sort of, again, like a tick box exercise so far. And I think this is so far in all global ocean governance, capacity building and technology transfer. It's wonderful that it's a fundamental part of these enormous agreements and policies. However, we're struggling on the implementation side of that. This is something that is very much being sort of sidelined when compared to other key things, whether that is during the BBNJ agreement negotiations or fundamentally at the ISA as well.
Thanks, Diva.
So it's just like a big rant. So thanks for enabling this.
No, you know what? We all need some catharsis right now in these times. So the next one I wanted to ask actually to all three of you. And I think, we're seeing this global debate that's spilling out of the ISA. Lots of other stakeholders, lots of other institutions are weighing in, and those are international institutions. But then this debate is also happening in national jurisdictions. We've seen how the Norway case went. Just recently, India, tried to open lease sales for national waters, and actually nobody bid. Which is kind of interesting. So this isn't just something that's happening at the ISA anymore, right? We're seeing it all over. So I wanted to ask what you think some of the most important to watch and or interesting kind of geopolitical dynamics are in this debate. What are you observing? What do you think? Maybe it's something that's, big like the US, or maybe it's something quieter that, you wish that more people were talking about or thinking about.
I mean, I guess I can go first. I think there's a lot of focus on these mining companies like the Metals Company and Possible Metals, GSR, that are pioneer companies. They're developing the technology and they're moving forward with the first experimental testbed mines because it's a very high risk endeavor. But I think the reality is that the nation states that plan on mining are the ones to really keep an eye on. China is putting tremendous investment into deep sea mining. India is putting tremendous investment into deep sea mining. Russia was putting a lot of investment in. I don't know how much they have left to invest in anything right now. But the actions of the major nation states, I think, are really what will define the future of the industry beyond the pioneer companies getting their test mines. But with that being said, the nation states do seem to be fairly hesitant to move forward at commercial scale. And I think the India lease sales is a good indicator of that. I've been talking to a bunch of people in the finance side of deep sea mining recently who are all saying that, if China actually wanted to deep sea mine, they'd already be doing it. But I don't think China thinks that it's profitable. I think they see it as a geopolitical position to take rather than a commercial position to take. And so, watching how those kinds of effects play out in the negotiations will be really important to seeing like where the next stage of deep sea mining is going to be. I think, unfortunately, I'm a little bit cynical, and I think we're very likely going to see at least some commercial test deep sea mines over the next 5 years if some of these pioneer companies get their way. But I don't think they're going to be at particularly large scale. And I think watching the finances develop on those and how profitable or not profitable they end up being is really going to shape what the negotiation looks like long term.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that's a really good
Um,
read.
It's an interesting moment that we live in. If you haven't seen Mark Carney's speech of Canada at the WEF, I recommend you watch it. He talks about this fundamental break that's happening in the world order, and the big things that are happening are the Trump tariffs, the war in Iran. But I actually think UNCLOS is just like one of those things of that's we're having this fundamental breakdown of the global order. And what the Trump administration is doing is it's like I don't think that UNCLOS will be the straw that breaks the camel's back, but it's definitely in the haystack. Um, and we're just seeing the unwinding of the post-World War II order. And it's affecting fishing and deep sea mining in the United Nations. And so this is just it's part of a larger pattern, in my opinion. But yeah, if you haven't seen that speech, especially if you're American, please take a moment to watch it.
So I'm going to jump in and disagree with Angelo because I actually
Oh
think
wow.
it's all about UNCLOS at the moment. So we talk about UNCLOS in terms of deep sea mining, of course, because we're deep sea ecologists and ocean conservationists who work on deep sea mining. Um, but UNCLOS is really being assaulted from all angles at this moment. UNCLOS it sets the structure for how we're going to mine the deep sea. It also sets the rules for whether or not you can limit navigation through straits. It sets the rules about how subsea cables can be laid and protected. It sets the rules about what you do when you have mariners stranded at sea after getting attacked by a nation state. So, I think there's a lot of things that are assaulting UNCLOS, particularly from the Trump administration, that are going to have major ramifications for the global order over the next 50 years. And one of my big fears is that we start seeing countries pull out of UNCLOS because we have a rogue state that is essentially ignoring all the principles that it used to adhere to.
I don't really want to follow that because it was so good, but I am going to throw in a 2 cents in that, to build off of the back of that, I put a link into the chat, which was an article that ran in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago about the CEO of the main mining company that's really been pushing. Really been accelerating this conversation, right? It is, I would say it's down to this company that this person runs as to why a lot of this has really ramped up in the last few years. And what we've seen with this company is that it started off by partnering with Nauru, Tonga, and
Kiribati.
Kiribati, thank you. Kiribati, and basically was using the messaging that it needed these minerals in order to help with the green transition. And particularly many of these countries that it had partnered with around their issues related to climate change and the severe challenges that they would be facing as a result of that. Many have argued that that has been essentially greenwashing of this industry, and this article does a good job of that. And I think essentially what has now been kind of laid bare for others is that, as Andrew says, some of these frontier companies are essentially kind of pump and dumps. This person that this article focuses on, he headed previous mining companies where essentially there was a lot of they were able to get a lot of investment, and then he sold off his shares, as did other high-level officials, and made a lot of money, and then the company eventually collapsed, right? And I think this is what we're seeing repeating here. And to build off of what Andrew has said is that this company, the metals company, has now latched on to the roguishness that is Trump, and essentially is using this rogue, what is becoming, no offense to Americans on the call, but it was what is eventually becoming a rogue state to push forward its interests. And that is now spinning out lots of other, how many companies did you say it was, Angelo, are now applying for licenses in the US? Many of these are also the same, right? They are these like fly-by-night startups that want to make a quick buck and don't necessarily have any intention of mining. There are, of course, others that do have intentions of mining, but that is really the kind of company that we've seen pushing this forward. And I think the messaging has now shifted because of the efforts of many NGOs, scientists, and others who have been able to push back and say, hey, this isn't about the green transition. That's BS, to be quite frank. And now this company and many others have moved their messaging away from the green transition and are now talking a lot about defense. I saw someone put into the chat earlier, defense spending being used, etc. And so this is really about geopolitical interests, I think, at this point, and also, again, the need for, well, the supposed need for minerals for defense. So it's been really fascinating to watch over the last sort of 5 to 10 years the evolution of messaging and the evolution of who are the main actors driving this entire industry forward.
Thanks, Diva. I think we're mind melding a little bit because I was going to ask Andrew a question along those lines, and I still will. Like Diva explained, we've seen the transition in sort of the pitch, going from green transition to national security. This is especially strong in the US right now. And there is kind of an interesting tension or nuance here where it's all about where are we getting the minerals from, and there's some talk but less talk about the processing, and like the state of processing for deep sea minerals is actually quite like on shaky ground. You know, you'll hear Republicans in congressional hearings talking about it a little bit, you'll hear TMC talking about it a little bit, but then like the actual reality of it isn't getting dug into very much. So Andrew, I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on actually like the metal demand realities first, and then also just the state of processing and what that actually, you know, what that actually looks like and what that whole chain looks like.
Yeah, sure. So, one of the funny things that's happened over the last 2 years is that it's all been the critical metals drum, strategic metals. Everyone's banging on that drum. And that is much like how deep sea mining is lumping three very different industries together. That's lumping a whole bunch of different metals together into a form that makes you think like, oh, we're going for critical metals. That means we're going for all critical metals. We're going for critical minerals. We're going to get all the critical minerals. We're getting our rare earth elements. Polymetallic nodule mining or polymetallic nodules have cobalt, they have nickel, they have copper, they have manganese. They don't have anything else. They really only account for 4 critical metals. And those critical metals are some of our least concerning critical metals. So manganese we get primarily from South Africa. They are an ally of the United States. There are no supply chain challenges without accessing manganese. Actually, deep sea mining may significantly impact South Africa's manganese mining industry because even a small deep sea mine, a 3 megaton mine, would produce 10% of the global manganese production for the world, and we're already in a little bit of a manganese surplus, so it would probably crash the market. Which is manganese, by the way, is half the value proposition for a nodule mine, which means if the manganese market crashes, there's almost no economic justification for deep sea mining. There's no way that any of these companies would be able to recoup their investment. Nickel and cobalt are very volatile metals. Their markets fluctuate all the time, depending on supplies coming from Indonesia and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Currently, both are also in a surplus. And then copper is a small component of polymetallic nodules, but copper is having its moment. Copper is currently, of those 4 metals, copper is probably the one in the highest demand right now with the highest supply chain challenges. But But with that being said, there is currently no refining capacity anywhere in the world for polymetallic nodules. There's a company in Japan that has some experimental refineries. China is developing refining capacity, but of course, the critical metals argument is that we can't be reliant on China, or we can't be reliant on other countries. We have to have internal capacity, and the U.S. has no internal capacity to refine any of these metals from a polymetallic nodule, and likely won't in the next 10 years. The expense of building out refining capacity is a very long-term investment proposal. So, I think the reality of deep sea mining is that many people went into the industry in the early 2000s and 2010s, looking at it as an environmentally responsible industry. I know, the principals, the leaders of the companies have other motivations for sure, but I think the rank and file folks who work for these companies, especially on the environmental teams, especially the ecologists and the geologists who are studying the nodules, genuinely do believe that it is a more environmentally acceptable approach to getting these metals. Um, and I think the reality of the situation is that there was no point in the history of modern deep sea mining where it was ever going to be a significant contributor to providing the metals necessary for the renewable energy revolution. The original environmental claims were that we need batteries, we need to be able to get off fossil fuel, we need to massively scale up our electrical generation capacity from renewable energy sources, and that requires copper, and that requires cobalt, and that requires nickel. And that was a real argument. That is a genuinely true thing. But if you look at the actual proposals and the timelines from deep sea miners, they were never going to get us to any kind of significant production before 2050. And probably, if they were given full bore permission to start now with no restrictions, they wouldn't be a significant contributor to the global metal supply chain before 2080, which is so far past the point where it matters for the renewable energy revolution that they're functionally not a contributor to that.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that's really useful. I find it interesting to always hear more about that. Um, Also important to flag for everyone on the call too that actually like a full scale mining machine in like the TMC model doesn't actually, it's not built yet, right? We have smaller scale mining machines and we have the all seas vessel, but we don't actually have like a full fleet. We don't have the full scale technology yet. So again, like Andrew said, it's like the
And the
timeline for
Allseas
the
the Allseas vessel is still requiring retrofit. I think the
yeah.
last estimate I saw was a 30% completion. They probably have a 2-year build out before even their boat is ready to go.
Yeah, so the timeline and the expense on these is it's massive. And we have a couple questions, and I think we've had a very good discussion. So I'm gonna try and go to the next one. Um, and we're pivoting a little bit. But I wanted to ask what you see the role of civil society orgs and other non-government groups being, and where can they most make a difference? I think maybe in response to everything that we've been discussing, where do the folks on this call sit? Maybe you can speak to something that you've seen as being effective in the past or as what you think would be more effective in the future. I think that would be great to weigh in on a little bit, and then I'll switch to some of the questions that are in the chat.
This is going to sound insane to a bunch of people who work on deep sea mining, but this is a niche issue that nobody works about, and civil society doesn't care about it, and they don't spend any money on it, and they have no idea any of this is going on. And thank you so much for all the hard work that you do. So I think it's more of what has kind of been going on. With what's happening in America with Trump, I think the threat is becoming more real for some people, and for some of the funders. But like when I worked at Pew for a bunch of years, and I sat next to Con Nugent when he ran the Pew's deep sea mining campaign. And that was like 15 years ago. So like I just know people have been working on deep sea mining for a very long time. Um, but this the I think part of the reason why the funders don't care about it is they still see it as a future threat, is it's something that's going to happen 30, 40, 50 years from now. And my God, the rest of the planet's on fire. So I'm going to use my money for things that are happening right now. Um, so I think communicating that this is imminent and that this is an imminent threat and that this really is happening. Um, if we were playing sports, we'd call that just going back to some of the basics of, just there are some people who haven't listened to this, and now they may be willing to listen, and it can be infuriating to say something for the 100th time and then only have somebody listen to you on the 100th time. But that's literally all of our jobs to do that, or at least it's mine. So, don't get too frustrated when you have to do that. But I do think that maybe there are some people who are more willing to listen. Um, and yeah, so like I mean, if we can get some of the funding community to pay more attention to this, I think that would be. And again, this is like the answer for every science conference. Oh, more funding. Uh, but I do think people are listening now.
Thanks. And yeah, for just on the issue of imminence, we were, Andrew and I were just talking about like the timeline or the horizon for this being longer than companies are saying. But I think, on the flip side of that, there is a risk of economies starting up around deep sea mining, right? And they're kind of like almost pyramid schemey, like company economies, right? But they pop up and then investors are trading and there's all these different things and it makes it more real even before there are boats in the water. So I think to be able to create real policy solutions to prevent that, to pivot away from it, like a moratorium or whatever it may be, I think that that is still useful because the more money is invested, the more these economies become robust, the more real it becomes, even if it doesn't start, commercially happening for 10 years or however long. So I think there's different levels of reality for this. And we're at a pretty unique point in time where it hasn't started commercially yet, which is quite rare from like an advocacy perspective.
But so the other thing to keep in mind is what's going to happen in the United States next year is the Trump administration is going to sell off vast tracts of the seafloor to companies, and they're going to give them a 10 to 20-year lease, and it's going to lock up all of these places for certain things. And so there actually are ways to stop deep sea mining before it happens. Like we have sanctuaries, we have monuments, we have it's called a 12A withdrawal. Like these are policies that we could put in place in the United States. But if they sell these leases off, we're not going to be able to put in place those other things. And so even if the deep sea mining doesn't happen for 10 or 15 years, um, we could sell the seabed next year, uh, and it'll be too late because they will already have the right to do it. And actually, similar to the way that we lease the seabed for oil drilling, those things, you do a little paperwork and you can get a renewal. And so it could be longer than 10 or 20 years that these resources are being locked up, and it's all going to happen in the next 2 years. All of the
Yeah.
politics.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And then Diva and Andrew, I don't know if you want to jump in on this a bit.
I just want to add a little bit in that I think, I'm a scientist who's chosen to try to engage with policy, and that has been like an absolutely fascinating road, as I'm sure others on the call have similar experiences. We're, participating in International Seabed Authority negotiations and BBNJ agreement negotiations. It's such a privilege to be able to watch history happening in real time, and not just watch history happening in real time, but to participate and help to steer the outcomes of these negotiations and help to steer the various regulations and policies that are being put in place for each of these. I think ocean governance more recently has been disproportionately, or rather, civil society has had a disproportionately large role in the outcome of a lot of these negotiations. And I say that from a very positive perspective, in that whether it's back channel conversations with sideline conversations during the negotiations or interventions on the floor, there is a lot of influence that has been happening, for better or for worse, from civil society. And that includes NGOs, that includes scientific experts, policy experts, etc. And we're seeing, so for instance, an example of that is these statements. I know, like I put the statements and you might think, oh, another thing to sign, right? Like, where do these actually go? But I can tell you that these ones, whether it is the fisheries statement, the corporate statement, or especially the ocean expert statement, in nearly every single media article that comes out about deep seabed mining, it is linked to in that article. That statement is cited on the whole, in the halls during these negotiations at the International Seabed Authority. Again and again, hundreds of scientific experts or policy experts say that this is not something that should move forward. And so these, even though it may seem like a small thing, this is one of those cases where you can influence these negotiations. Your voice does matter. And I know that's more difficult when there are rogue states, etc. But at the like the US right now, but at the International Seabed Authority, that these things are absolutely playing a role. The same thing for scientists. A lot of the science that's being produced by, for instance, Andrew, others on the call, myself, that science is being cited in those negotiating halls. It is having an impact. And so I think this is not something that's happening in Kingston and is out of your control. This is something that you absolutely can also have your say in. And apart from, participating and engaging in some way, I think one of the best things we can do, as Angelo said, this is not something the majority of people know about. Raising awareness about this issue and how to engage, I think, is also something that's very easily done.
Yeah. Thanks, Diva. Andrew, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add beyond those two very excellent answers. But just to say that because it is such a niche issue, sorry, because it is such a niche issue, because there's so few voices at the table, there's tremendous potential for someone who wants to get loud to really have an influence in particularly the national conversation. Less so the international conversation because that's just a much more structured process. But within the United States, talking about it, writing op-eds for your local papers, giving talks. One of the things I like to encourage everyone who wants to start getting involved in policy is, as a scientist, is okay. Well, the first thing you should do is go give a talk at your public library and figure out what you want to say and how you want to say it. So those small local things. I mean, I know it's a very trite thing to say. We say it all the time for like every issue. Like the advice for how to get people involved in deep sea mining is not different from the advice in any other, major political challenge of our time, but it's, speak up, um, you know, reach out to your community, build coalitions, and start making noise.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And maybe if I can offer two situations where that worked. In Canada, with a very, very small coalition of NGOs and not a lot of funding, we did end up changing the government position, and Canada announced support for a moratorium in 2023. And that position has held through a government change, right, with this new Carney government. So, there was like five of us who were like, holding that campaign together in Canada. And then if you also look at the Norway situation, they were on the verge of opening up, seabed close to Svalbard. And this last December, they announced a 4-year pause, right, for this entire government term, in large part because of scientists and civil society actors and just the tremendous fight that they put up. So I think, like the US is very dire. It feels very dire, but we have real world examples where this has worked and where really civil society organizations and scientists have prevailed. And I think that's very exciting to remember. Um, and I think with that, I will pivot to we have just a couple questions, I think, in the chat. If you have more, please put them in and I'll just go through. I think this one's for Andrew. Sorry, going back to what you were talking about earlier. Could defense/military funds contribute towards that direction in deep sea exploration? So I think that's when we were talking about companies funding a lot of deep sea exploration.
So there is a long and storied history of the military academic complex in deep sea exploration. Actually, for the vast amount of time in the U.S., deep sea exploration has been predominantly funded by military goals. Um, I don't necessarily know if that is the best model. ONR certainly funds a lot of research now. And in the future, the Navy provides a lot of support vessels. The DSV Alvin is a U.S. Navy asset, so the Alvin pilots are also U.S. Navy submarine commanders. And so that relationship and that partnership has been an ongoing thing. That being said, the U.S. military has strategic goals that are not the same as scientific goals. And so I think that there does need to be very clear distinctions between what are military assets and military projects and what are pure scientific exploration and discovery projects. And I think, building tighter inroads with the U.S. military is not necessarily the best way to go forward, especially when we're talking about things like global class research vessels, where we're sailing in the high seas, where we're sailing into other nations' waters, where we're partnering with other nations to do this research. Those should not be military partnerships. Those should be civilian partnerships.
Thanks, Andrew. I hope that answered the question. I thought it was a great answer. The next question is there are a tremendous amount of scientists and NGOs against deep sea mining. Why are they not all being pulled together into one very large international voice? It's too fragmented. A large mass of intelligence will get attention. I don't know if anyone wants to jump on this. I also could jump on this, but Diva or Angelo, maybe.
I'll answer it with a joke that my friend Dr. Bob Richmond likes to say is that if you ask two scientists for an opinion, you'll get three. Have you ever worked with a liberal before? Liberals spend 99% of our time fighting the people we agree with 99% of the time. I think I think that's just human dimensions is the reason why we don't all work together. And people have opinions, and we're human beings, and we do the best that we can.
Yeah, I would say maybe, sorry, I'd offer a slightly less skeptical answer. We do have the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, which has over 130 member organizations. We're partnered with DOSI. IUCN is even a part of the DSCC. We have a flag at the ISA. We bring, our members to the ISA under that flag, and quite a few of the members also attend ISA meetings and then run national campaigns. We have member calls, we have regional working groups. So not to plug, but I run the North America Regional Working Group. So I think if your organization is interested, if you personally are interested, there are ways to get involved with the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. If you're in the US, there's also the National Ocean Protection Coalition, the NOPC, and they're doing a huge amount of organizing work around the RFIs and or the request for information and the BOEM and DSHMRA applications. So some of these coalitions do exist. It's probably our fault if you haven't heard of them, but they do exist. And please, let people on this call know if you want to get more involved with them, because we're here.
Yeah, I do want to give the slightly less flippant answer, lest people think I don't take this seriously. Another reason is people have different reasons for being involved in this. For the domestic U.S. stuff, there are some people who it's more of like a racial equity colonial issue, and there's some people for whom it's an environmental issue, and there's others for whom it's an economic issue, and they don't see eye to eye on every single thing, and so it's just because of the different viewpoints. You can't have there's no one right answer, and there's no one right talking point, and I think at the end of the day, that's actually a good thing. It shows that there's widespread opinions, that people are looking at these issues from slightly different angles and coming to very, very similar conclusions that this is something that's going to harm them. I do have a weird sense of humor, so I apologize if I was a little off-putting for folks on that one.
You're correct. It's very hard. The coalition work is not for the faint of heart, but we are here. Andrew, sorry, you wanted to jump in on this too, I think.
Oh, no, the issues have already been addressed. That's all right.
So I don't see any other questions in the chat, but please, if you have any, put your hand up now and ask them. And if not, we'll do one final question that leads into our sort of like broader workshop topic. So I don't see any coming in. Our last question is if you could each name a policy lever that you think has traction at national and international levels and why you think these are successful. And we'll try and discuss these policy levers or policy mechanisms, within the group as well. And David has a couple of questions associated that we'll use to discuss them. So if each panelist could come up with one.
I'll just throw, On the domestic side, and this may or may not apply to the international side, is marine protected areas of which, look at what I've written for the last 20 years. I have many opinions on them. But like, we can proactively protect the most ecologically and culturally important places around the world, in different countries. We have mechanisms for doing that. Even under Trump, um, the marine protected areas are holding for deep sea mining. For fishing, it's a different story. But that's it's a complicated topic. Creating marine protected areas is just as complicated as mining the deep sea. There's lots of human dimensions. But when they work really well. And there's a whole body of science that shows that to be the case.
Awesome. Thank you. So we have marine protected areas, right, and protection as one.
So, again, from the U.S. perspective, I think long term to uh, kind of reduce the ongoing threat of the U.S. going rogue every 4 to 8 years, because we are a schizophrenic country that decides to oscillate between two extremes over and over again. I think the most effective policy lever on that front is advocating for the ratification of UNCLOS. Um, and it seems like a pipe dream every so often. We had some inertia for it in 2012, and that kind of fizzled out. It's likely there will be a large enough swing in Congress that we could see a renewed push for the ratification of UNCLOS in 2026 or 2028. That all remains to be seen, but in terms of the most effective way to kind of shut down the US's rogue actions is to get them at the table with the proper negotiation. Um, Short term within the US is the same advice that it is for everything else, is pushing for changes in congressional leadership. And I think that is kind of the most effective thing you can do right now as a non-expert on deep sea mining, is to be pushing for a Congress that is resistant to the Trump agenda.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, Diva, one more policy lever.
This is really hard to answer. I'm surprised actually none of the US folks said litigation. I think this is something we're going to see more and more. I mean, it's seriously, right? I think it's something that has led to some pretty landmark changes, and certainly might play a role later on, from a domestic standpoint. But from an international standpoint or related to the ISA, I mean, I think something that I've found particularly eye-opening watching for the last few years is the kind of like domino effect that happens. This may seem like this like massive beast, and we're not sure how to tackle it, but actually it is lots of individual pieces. And by overturning or flipping each of those pieces, then you come up with a whole. And so, and I'm sure Nicole and others might have more to add to this, but in the context of the ISA, working with specific governments. So I am from Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm fortunate enough that at many of these negotiations, it's been easy enough to just go up to the representative, the delegate from Trinidad and Tobago, and start a conversation, and then eventually that relationship has grown and there's been trust built. Having outreach to your government officials, that sometimes can lead to very significant changes, and being resilient around that. I mean, there are many countries, Nicole, I'm sure you can share more about your experience with Canada, but where through years of sustained engagement and relationship building, it then leads to a place where there is trust and there is influence. And I think that, at the International Seabed Authority in 2022, at the United Nations Ocean Conference, that was when the first 3 or 4 countries stepped up and said, hey, we want to call for a moratorium, or pause. And slowly over time, there have been folks in each of the countries where there has been a position that's come forward that have worked tirelessly towards those changes. And so I think that it's like And slowly, and over time, over those 4 years, we've gone from 3 to 40, right? And who knows where we'll be in the next 2 or 3 years. And so I do think the like resilience, it's not a policy lever, but I do think resilience is really important. And that outreach to government, it can play a very pivotal role, whether that is through NGOs or scientific bodies or just directly to the government if you are able to do that. Nicole, did you want to add
Yeah.
something?
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, the US situation right now with the government is, it is what it is. But I think in other countries, I really can't stress enough how much understanding which inroads you have as a citizen within the government and then utilizing them is helpful. Like if you're in a parliamentary system, often there are things like you can do parliamentary petitions. You can see if members of parliament will sponsor like order paper questions or parliamentary questions. Sometimes citizens themselves can ask parliamentary questions depending on how your system is set up. Um, Trying to get op-eds even placed in certain areas. But I really think like the parliamentary work worked extremely well in Canada. And so I mean, it's hard because I want a policy lever that's maybe a little bit broader. So I would say not just parliamentary work, but just understanding your local government and which inroads work, and what opportunities you have to try and get these questions placed, um, to try and get deep sea mining on some kind of agenda, right? If it's trying to get a Senate committee talking about it, an advisory committee talking about it. Like, what can you do in each jurisdiction that just raises it up? I think that's really helpful. So yeah, in the Canada context, we did parliamentary petitions, order paper questions, letters to government, and a public campaigning push as well. And so all of those things together created the Canada campaign. But it's really just those little cracks, right, in the government that you can push into. I think whatever you can find is super important.
And I think,
Um,
in the Norway context, that ultimately it was several NGOs, including WWF being a major proponent, advocating against deep sea mining because Norway was very much one of the most vocal states about deep sea mining in the Arctic and within their national jurisdiction and on the continental shelf. And WWF and other local NGOs and experts really pushed the government relentlessly. And eventually, WWF did sue the government. Isn't that correct? Right.
yeah.
And so there was litigation happening, and all of that culminated in the government then committing to not move deep seabed mining forward for a certain amount of years recently. So we have been able to like see the direct, like the actions that many are taking culminate in these really big changes at a national level and then at international level also.
Yeah, thanks, Diva. Yeah, so now I'm going to pass to David to do the workshopy next part of this overall program. But thank you so much to the panelists. That was an amazing discussion. Your answers were fantastic. And I hope everyone in the audience really appreciated them and appreciated what it's like to have like these three panelists all on one panel giving their time. It's really wonderful and quite an honor to be in the discussion. So thank you guys.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, the panelists. This has been very enriching and illustrating, and I do agree. We are so lucky to have you all together discussing all this. We are going to take a 10-minute break before we go into the next part of the workshop, which is going to be a bit more interactive. We're going to have breakout groups after the break. Probably just a couple of groups where we will be discussing the policy levers that we just heard about, following some guiding questions that we have prepared. But I will explain the dynamics in more detail after the break. So now I will see you all in exactly 10 minutes. Have a nice break.
So yeah,
Sorry,
thanks, Amy. Great.
just a quick comment. For someone who wants to speak, please introduce yourself before so we all know who you are, where you're coming from. And so for that, I also invite Amy to introduce herself now before we move on to the next. There is also a link on the chat to a whiteboard if you want to use sticky notes with your thoughts on each of the policy levers. But I also encourage everyone to speak up here during our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I am the Ocean and Climate Advisor at Oceans North, and I'm based in Halifax on the east coast of Canada. Thanks.
Amy, and I see Ernesto, who's another one of my colleagues. So Oceans North is really pulling their weight, really pulling their weight here.
Yeah, I guess we're monopolizing the conversation. Ernesto Fernandez Mole, I'm the International Oceans Director at Oceans North, based in Halifax. I mean, I don't know, this probably will be relevant, but I guess the question is also what, in terms of jurisdictions, maybe looking at the champion countries that might be champions that we want to, focus on. For instance, there is this France-led coalition of countries, Ocean Pioneers, that is linking BB&J and deep sea mining. I think it's led also in conjunction with Panama and maybe other countries in the Pacific. But anyway, there's this something that we need to look into, looking at the champions, and maybe since there is this initiative already to combine these two, BB&J and DSM might be something to consider.
Thanks, Ernesto. And we had another comment in the chat just about MPAs, if locally and regionally developed, managed and enforced can be universal tools. So yeah, I think that's a really good contribution as well. Thank you. So our next question is which stakeholders should be engaged for this lever, which I think is an interesting one for MPAs, other area-based management tools, and it's something that we talked quite a lot about in the panel discussion. So if anyone wanted to weigh in on that, please do.
Should I go?
This is really Oceans North dominated. Yeah, you can go and maybe inspire someone, or if our panelists wanted to weigh in a little bit more as
Yeah, well,
well.
the issue, I guess, since I mean, this is something that we discuss in our, different meetings related to ISA and our campaigns, but looking at other industries like inline mining and things that might be affected by this, or fisheries, other industrial sectors might be important to consider. And on our work, we engage a lot with indigenous communities, so engaging with right holders will be important to bring on other voices, and I will close with youth people as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ernesto. That's great. And yeah, Diva, jump in.
At risk of derailing everything, because the conversation has been a little sticky so far, I wonder if it would be perhaps we can use the remaining time or some of the remaining time to actually discuss what the SCB can do. I threw some questions into the chat, which was, has the SCB as a body taken positions on certain things before? Has there been precedent in that respect? And if yes, it would be great to hear about those, and then perhaps it might be useful for those who are here to chat a little bit about what are actions that the SCB itself or its members could take particularly.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion to pivot. I think we did get to talk a little bit about the levers when you all presented them. So maybe we do fast forward a little bit and talk more about concrete next steps and SCB, as I think most of you are members. David, if that works for you. I know
Yeah,
it's been a long workshop already, so
yeah, no, that sounds great to me. And yeah, I was replying on the chat to your question, Diva, about this, and I think it will be great to hear, since I don't know if you are all members, SCB members, but even if you are not, I will be very happy to gather ideas on what you think SCB can do about deep sea mining. For reference, we have signed other petitions before, policy letters, expert letters, etc., on different policy issues that pertain to marine conservation. That was something that was done before my time at SCB a number of times. Since I am the policy officer, I think we have signed maybe 3 petitions in the last 2 years. So if we could have people to write a draft or a letter, SCB will be happy to sign as an organization once we have the letter complete, especially if it's a letter come from experts like you all. So I'm open to hearing all sorts of ideas on what we can do to support the marine conservation community as a whole in our work towards reducing the impacts of deep sea mining, or avoiding the impacts of deep sea mining.
I think Diva also made a good suggestion earlier just about signing like the scientist statement and supporting existing platforms that have gotten a boost but could use a new boost. It's always helpful, if we got like 30 new signatures or it reaches over 1,000 people, then that's something that can get a little bit of boost, right, in social media or in the media, and it's always helpful. So that's also another thing that SCB members can help with. We also got another question in the chat from Catherine. I have a general question for the stakeholder issue. Across each of these policy levers, where do you most see opportunities for the general public to have an impact? And I think that flows in well with the what can SCB do question as well. So maybe I'll throw that back to Diva and Andrew a little bit about, where does the general public have opportunities for impact in all of this? So not just like NGOs, but just the people.
Andrew, you want to go first?
I had a feeling you were about to.
You're a good sport, Andrew.
I mean, for niche issues like this, it's not particularly groundbreaking advice, but it's to make noise, to reach out to your representatives. It's to let, the person who represents you in Congress and the Senate know where you stand on these particular, I mean, in the US context at least, know where you stand on these particular issues. And talking to your community, writing op-ed, like I say, writing op-eds a lot because I think writing op-eds are really important. Getting those letters to the editor out, I think, shape a lot more of the public discourse than people are willing to admit. And letting your congressional representatives know where you stand, and then voting for congressional representatives that represent what you stand for. I think on big issues like deep sea mining, where it is such a small cohort of people that are functionally at the decision-making table, it really comes down to making sure that you've put the right people at that table.
I agree with that, and I also, I think there's top-down change and there's bottom-up change. And as Catherine probably knows better than all of us, the the potential and precedent that has been set in the past with the public becoming galvanized on an issue and that then leading to the change at the regulatory level, that's something we've seen many times before. And so I think with this regard, this issue is just so unknown to the many that one of the best things that we can do, apart from reaching out to government representatives, is just raising awareness of the issue. And we know, for better or for worse, how useful social media can be for that, how useful WhatsApp can be for that, etc. And so I do think there's just chatting with your friends the next time you meet up. Like, these are the kinds of things that just getting this conversation out there so that folks are more aware. It doesn't always lead to action, but often it does.
Yeah, I think that's really great. And I think, one of the levers that I brought up was like parliamentary action or localized action, which I think ties into what Diva and Andrew were saying as well. And for a lot of these things, sometimes it's just numbers, right? It's a numbers game. It's signatures. How many signatures can you get on something? How many questions can you get submitted? How many Freedom of Information Act requests can you get submitted? Just stuff like that. Like I'm really fun at parties. I would go to my friends' parties when we had the parliamentary petition, and I would bring it with me and get people to sign it because sometimes you have to get like in-person signatures. And these are things you can do at barbecues or, go to coffee shops or public places. Anyway, I think there's lots of ways to get people involved who aren't necessarily in the advocacy space. And going back to Andrew's comment about the library talks and stuff, I think education is huge. If you can find ways just for people to know about what's going on, I think that's really a big first step. And David, I don't know if you want to do like a final round maybe of ideas for SCB that you envision coming out of this, like different action items or.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I understand. Everyone is very tired after such a long workshop. It's been very intense, with a lot of information, and quite long. In terms of what the SCB could do, that's something that I was expecting to have ideas from this workshop on. The things that I can think of that we could start working on it. If, for example, if there is interest in creating a committee within SCB among the members, we can start communicating about that with all the attendants here and see if someone will be keen to be part of a deep sea mining committee where we can include experts to start working on drafting a policy letter, for example, that we can sign as experts, but also from the organization, from the SCB. Other things that I think will be interesting is based on the talks and conversations that we had in this workshop, creating something like a practical guide for SCB members and beyond on, for example, how the ISA works, and where input is welcome in any of the ISA processes. Obviously, I'm not an expert on that, so I will actually consult with all of you when creating something like this. But I also want to know what could be possible to do in the next, let's say, 12 to 18 months, and that's a tricky part for SCB. I don't know what the next policy officer will want to do, but I have a year left at SCB as the policy officer, and I think we will need to focus on something that can be delivered short term. So that's why I envision something like a short policy letter from experts right now, and a guide on how to provide input to ISA or other agencies or our governments even. So what other ideas? Policy relevant science statement. I'm trying to think about timelines for this, because it's tricky with so many people involved in this. But my thoughts for this were, so after the workshop, I will send some of these potential ideas, outputs, and other ideas to all the participants with a short summary of the key findings in the workshop, as well as the recording and the slides. And I think I will actually ask for feedback from everyone on emails to get ideas on what we can do. And if I think there's enough support for something like a policy letter, we can move on with that, or some guide on how to make petitions on this for your governments and the jurisdictions where you are. So I think that with that we can close the workshop unless there's any other comments from anyone else. I don't see any other questions or comments on the chat. So I want to thank everyone, especially the speakers and the moderator, for their time. This has been exceptional and very thoughtful and constructive workshop, in my opinion. And I hope that we will, from this, something helpful for the wider marine conservation community will emerge for us to move on our work to, as I said, avoid the damages of deep sea mining. So on behalf of the SCB Marine Program, thank you again to all for your time and your engagement. And you will hear from me by email very soon. So have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.